I'm Ari Gronich, and this is Create a New Tomorrow podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Create a New Tomorrow. I am your host, Ari Gronich, and I am back with Dr. David Gruder. He is a 12-time award-winning integrative psychologist. And more than that, he's an organizational psychologist. He has done some amazing things. I call him the guru of gurus, the mentor of mentors. And welcome back, David. I am so glad that we're able to do this again and provide so much more of your wisdom to the audience.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Ari.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in organizational psychology. Why did you choose that field specifically? And what it is that you're looking to create in this new tomorrow, a new world?
Mm-hmm. So how I got into the field kind of starts at age 16. I was expected to become a professional musician and was certainly on track for that. I had started performing as a child in a lot of different capacities. And so I was not being asked, what university are you going to? I was being asked, what conservatory are you going to? And by the time I was 16, in some way that is still kind of magical and mysterious to me, I knew that even though music was and is my first love, psychology was my calling. And I also knew that I was called to have impact on elevating society, not just on individuals. And so in my doctoral program, I selected a doctoral program that was going to enable me to get a PhD that was split between clinical psychology, which is the deep inner work, and organizational development psychology, which is the interpersonal, the work of what happens in groups and systems. And so that was my best way to equip myself to elevate leaders and cultures throughout my career.
That's awesome. You know, one of the things that I say a lot is we made this shit up and we can make it up better.
Yeah.
And I think that people forget in many cases that the society as it is a figment of our imagination. We created it. We created the buildings. We created the design of the houses. We created the design of the societies. And when something is suboptimal, not up to performance standards, right? Then it's kind of incumbent upon us to recreate it in a different, better way. But we have organized around our creation. And there's a psychological element to this is how we live, and this is how we're always going to live, and this is how we should live. And we want to go back to the way that it was, right? Or the way that we think it should be. How do you break through that kind of organizational, whether it's in corporations, in governments, in whatever, or in families, or in yourself, even the organizational, how you've organized your own being? What would be some tools, some ways that people could think about this a little bit differently so they'd be open to the possibilities?
Oh, great question. I agree with you completely. We have massive imaginations as human beings. We're incredible, natural, compulsive storytellers. We make up stories left and right. And so, yes, everything we see around us is of our creation. We invented an imaginary thing called a corporation, corporate structure. We invented an imaginary thing called money. I mean, we could go down a whole long list of things that we invented, and then those things started being or seeming real to us. So the tail's wagging the dog in that sense. And so where this starts is with a personal ownership piece and a societal ownership piece. So the personal ownership piece for me has to do with responsibility. I and I alone am responsible for the parts of reality that I pay attention to, for the stories I make up about what those parts of reality that I'm paying attention to mean, for the emotions that the stories I tell myself about the parts of reality that I'm attending to activate in me, and for the words and actions that the emotions I'm having about the stories I'm telling myself about the parts of reality that I'm paying attention to have on those to whom I'm in relationship or with whom I'm in relationship. That to me is the essence of spiritual responsibility. So that's the personal side of it. There's a societal side of it too. Should I go on to that piece, or did you want to?
Yes, please.
So the societal responsibility part has to do with the intersection of freedom and responsibility, which we seem to have forgotten collectively as a society, even though I know certain individuals who haven't forgotten that, but as a society, we seem to have forgotten it. There are lots of people who are taking the position essentially that the most important thing in society is freedom. And others are saying the most important thing in society is responsibility, social responsibility. And both groups are equally and oppositely insane because of what they've forgotten. Because freedom without responsibility is narcissism, and responsibility without freedom is tyranny. And when we have forgotten that we invented society, and that society or society's rules are not meant to be the boss of us, they are meant to be in service to our evolution as a species and our stewardship of a planet. When we forget those things, then we have everything upside down. Same thing goes with patriotism, by the way. I view patriotism as nested dolls. Those Russian or Ukrainian dolls where there's a doll within a doll within a doll?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is something else that we've forgotten as a planet collectively. Again, individuals are exceptions to this, where we take a position that my country comes first, and whatever impact that has on your country, well, that's your problem. Well, patriotism, if it's integrated and if it's sane, it's nested. So my first responsibility is to stewarding the planet. My second responsibility is to humanity. Inside of that, I have patriotism to my country, to my religious or spiritual groups, to my communities, to my business, et cetera, et cetera. And inside of that is my patriotism to my family and my primary love relationship, and to myself. When we are in either or thinking that says I have to sacrifice one of those nested dolls for the other nested dolls, or in order to attend to one nested doll, I have to be willing to sacrifice the rest, I'm engaging in insane societal thinking.
That's really interesting. I think a lot of people believe that they have to focus the exact opposite of what you just said, right? Self, family, city, county. I mean, it goes out, and then eventually maybe we'll get to the world at large, right? Or humanity at large, and so forth. I never quite understood the idea of patriotism. And I'll tell you why. Patriotism to me has always been the same thing as being a white supremacist, or saying to somebody, I'm proud to be white, I'm proud to be black, I'm proud to be blue, I'm proud to be green. It's something that you have no control over where you were born, right? So you're born in Latvia versus being born in the US. So all of a sudden you must be a lower form of human because you were born there, but you had no choice in that. Just like you must be, if you're black, you must be a lower form of a human being because of your color, even though you had no particular choice in that, and it really relates nothing to character. So how do we evolve beyond the label of, well, any of the labels, but beyond the label of patriotism, beyond the label of I'm proud because of what I am versus what I do?
Right. Oh my gosh, there are so many layers to this question. You know, let me start with what you said about in this narrative of a person saying, I, I, I can't help where I was born or the color of my skin. Even that is open to question. You know, there are metaphysical belief systems that say that we do choose our life circumstances. So the humility piece with this is to remember that all belief systems, every belief system this planet has ever seen, is based on its own set of core assumptions, such as I I chose where, you know, the circumstances under which I was born. I didn't choose those core assumptions that are neither verifiable nor unverifiable, that can neither be proved nor disproved. And when we forget that, we move straight into arrogance. My belief system is the right belief system because, after all of the other beliefs that my core assumptions are based on make sense with my core assumptions. So my belief system must be right. Well, it does. It doesn't must be right. That's erroneous thinking. That's arrogant thinking. And the reason that's important to the question that you were asking is because when I approach these kinds of questions of paradigm, of belief system from a place of humility, then I get to see everyone else as my brothers and my sisters. I get to see people who have different life experiences from mine that have lessons and wisdom to teach me, just as I have certain life experiences that might have wisdom to offer others. And it's not a competition over who has more wisdom for whom. It is this delicious opportunity. Life is this delicious opportunity to compare notes and learn from each other and discover more about the bigger picture from the smaller slices that we each see individually. When we have that kind of attitude, we are able to sit in the both and of relishing our own identity, relishing the unearned privileges and the unearned targeting that we get to experience as a result of the life that we have been born into. And we get to relish the diversity of humanity. So instead of it being one or the other, that I'm either only identified through the color of my skin, or I refuse to recognize that my skin has a particular tint to it. How about both and?
It's a really interesting point of view. I think that what that does for people when they adopt that kind of a point of view is it allows for an openness and a willingness to understand another's point of view. And I'll give you an example of an experience that I had about 10 years or so ago. I had a roommate who was a Palestinian Muslim woman, and I am a Latino Jew who I call myself a mutt because I have pieces of, I think, everything inside of me. So I've never actually identified as a label, but I've definitely got a lot of that Jewish culture and Latino culture in me. And so she and I would have these amazing conversations about the Palestinian and Jewish and Israeli conflict, the
Yeah.
Muslim and Jewish conflict. And what was fascinating is her cousin was an attorney who worked for Hamas, PLO, and the government of Palestine. and did negotiations with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually had an opportunity in those conversations to create some real change, because what I didn't know is she would call him up after we had a conversation and say, okay, you might want to talk to them about this. You might want to, right? You might want to have these kinds of conversations with when doing the negotiating. And she was like a sister to me. We didn't have that feeling of being separate, as even with our separate thoughts and our separate opinions. We didn't agree on everything for sure, but she was like a sister. We considered ourselves each other family. And that allowed for so much healing within both of us from what we preconceived as in, what's the word that they use in divorce?
Irreconcilable differences.
Irreconcilable differences, yes. So what we would consider to be irreconcilable differences became very reconcilable, very common for us to get to a level of understanding where we were the same, where we were different, how that happened. And I find that what you're saying is that kind of a conversation when doing peace talks would be so beneficial. Yeah, to have that kind of a conversation with the people who disagree with us. And that's whether it's, in this day and age, is the mask versus the no mask, right? Or the hug versus no hug, social distance versus come together. If we're able to have these kinds of conversations, don't you think we would get along way much better in society?
Not only would we get along much better, but the quality of our problem solving would skyrocket. Because when people are in their own silos, when they're in what is in some circles, the circles that study propaganda, they call them information bubbles. They're only getting a reflection of their own beliefs coming back at them from social media and other internet sources, because of how the algorithms are actually set up on the internet, where the algorithms are deciding for us what we're going to get exposed to, what products we're going to get exposed to, what perspectives we're going to get exposed to. And when we're in information bubbles, that's a prescription for divisiveness, because in an information bubble, because all I'm seeing is my own reflection, it's easy to imagine that I must be right. Whereas when we're given these sacred opportunities to really know and interact with people who have very different life experiences and backgrounds than we do, then there's a level of richness that expands our vision of ourselves, of our world, and of what solutions could look like.
Yeah, that's really cool. I was watching a video recently, and it was a gentleman who, what they say infiltrated the KKK. He was a black gentleman, but he didn't infiltrate. He just started having conversations with one of the grand poobah.
Yes.
I don't know what they call them, grandmasters of the KKK,
Yep.
and over the years they became very close friends, began to trust each other because they got to know each other.
Yes.
Then I believe that it's somewhere around 60, 70 different members of the KKK ended up denouncing that belief system. They
Mm-hmm.
still liked the camaraderie that came from being part of the group, right? But they denounced what the group was focused on, I guess you could say. And it's an interesting form of psychology. You get to learn about somebody or about a different culture, and all of a sudden it opens your eyes and heart, right? They say that the cure to racism is traveling. What do you think of that statement?
Yes. The cure to centrism, any kind of ethnocentrism, is to be exposed to other cultures. The conversations that I have with my fellow Americans who have not traveled extensively outside of the United States are profoundly different from the conversations that I have with my fellow Americans who have traveled extensively. And by travel, I don't mean that that somebody has gone to another country and then they've stayed in American hotels and eaten American foods and gotten tours around whatever that location is by American tour guides. That's not traveling. That's pretending to travel. I'm talking about the real deal. And when we're exposed to other cultures, if we have any kind of teachability in us at all, we can't help but be impacted. We can't help but have our worldview expanded. When people are very, very ethnocentric, whatever the centrism is about, American centric, let's say, because they've never traveled outside of the United States. They may not have even traveled to all the different sections of our country, because our country is a bunch of mini countries culturally. You know, the culture in the deep South is not the same as the culture in New York or as the culture in California, et cetera, et cetera. The blindness that people end up having, they don't know it. I call it a spell. Most people in my experience are under a cultural spell. They don't know how to see that they're under a spell, and therefore they don't know that there's something to get free of. And it's incredibly damaging.
Yeah, that's interesting. I used to, I'm very good with accents, right? And I used to be able to tell if somebody was from Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Manhattan, which New York accent it was that they had. Just
Yeah.
could tell if somebody was from Texas or if they were from Tennessee, right? From their accent. And what you just said is so true. We are such a diverse culture of many different countries. You know, this whole thing about us being a melting pot. And so here's my question to you. If we're a melting pot of all of these different cultures, how do we convince or shift the perspective of American to a community of melting pot people? So when, you know, when we hear people say, if you don't like it, leave it, or if you're, you know, if you think differently than I do, you should leave the country, or whatever those statements are that people make. How do we shift that so that people understand that this melting pot and the differences in culture is what makes us great, not what weakens us?
A great question again. I think that what will help a lot is understanding the pendulum swing in the immigrant mindset that we've undergone over the last 80 years or so, 70 years, somewhere in that time frame. There was a time when the immigrant mindset, the dominant immigrant mindset, was you come to the United States and you leave your old country, your old culture behind, and you assimilate into being an American. And what that looked like back then, and I grew up in a family like this, was that you gave up the language of the country that you came from, and you gave up its cultural traditions, and you tried to blend into some notion of what being an American was. And now we are at the other end of that pendulum swing, where we have people that have no desire, some people, not all people, but some people have no desire to assimilate into American society. They want the experience of being in this country while staying fully identified with whatever the culture, country, or languages that they came from. And I think both of those perspectives have massive blind spots. We have to have a common bond, a common sense of purpose and mission. And that common bond is, in the context of the United States, would be the original version of the American dream, the version of the American dream that birthed this country, not the delusional version of the American dream that it was replaced with in the 1950s. And the diversity piece of that is that inside of this common bond that I share with you, I relish my uniqueness as an individual, as a culture, my ability to speak multiple languages, God forbid, like most Europeans are multilingual. Most Americans are not multilingual. And in Europe, there's no fear. When I'm working in Switzerland, there is no fear that I encounter among the Swiss, for example, that they're losing their culture because they're having conversations in French, in German, in Italian, and in one of the native versions of Swiss language, which is called Romanche. There's no feeling of, oh, I'm suddenly not Swiss because I'm speaking all of these languages. There's a both and about that. There's pride in being Swiss and in what the Swiss culture collectively stands for. And at the same time, there's a joy in expressing a flavor of that version of being Swiss. We're missing that in this country. We're missing the both and. We're in a war between blind acculturation or a refusal to acculturate. It's got to be both.
That is so true. You know, my grandfather came over to this country when he was 12 years old, I believe, by himself on a boat through Ellis Island, became a multi-millionaire, lost it all, gained it all, lost it all, gained it all. But he spoke 11 languages, 11, Austro-Hungarian, Yiddish, Hebrew, Spanish, French. I mean, he spoke German, a lot of languages because, as a salesman, that was his job. But even before he was 12, growing up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was initially taught, and this was in maybe the late 1800s, early 1900s, he was taught these languages as just you're being born, you're growing up, and you're learning. My parents, on the other hand, my dad, who speaks German and Spanish and English and Yiddish, right? But they only spoke Spanish if they didn't want us to know what they were saying. Right? And so I took a lot of years of Spanish, but I never learned how to speak it fluently or fluidly, I should say. Same with Hebrew. I took Hebrew school, but when I went to Israel, I couldn't speak Hebrew for anything based on how they speak it on the streets, right?
Absolutely.
So I felt, and every time I've traveled, I have felt so culturally inept because of my lack of being able to speak another language. So what you just said is so true. And I really appreciate you saying that, because when you speak somebody else's language, you get to know their culture much better, right? Especially if you could dream in their language. Did I lose you?
There you are. You froze for a moment. Yes, indeed. So you and I came from very similar families. Both sides of my family came from what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. One side of my family came from the Austrian side. The other side of the family came from the Hungarian side. And my parents as well, both of whom were born in the United States. It's their parents who came over from Europe. My parents, when they didn't want my brother and me to understand what they were talking about, that's when they talked Yiddish. And when I first started traveling extensively internationally in the 1970s, what I discovered, to my great delight, was that the two fastest ways to access the heart of a country that I was in were to speak its language and eat its food. And hang out with people who were from that country rather than go looking for other Americans to hang out with. And And I got huge enrichment from the willingness to be a clumsy imbecile in another language, because what I found very rapidly was that most people in the countries that I visited were very appreciative and forgiving of my inability to speak their language, simply because I was authentically attempting to speak their language. And it opened up all kinds of doors.
That's a really good point. Um, when I was in Greece during the 2004 Paralympics, we learned a lot of Greek because I was going to be there for a month, and I had to learn it. I had to learn what they were saying on the trail, the trains
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And some of the words that are not appropriate to say, right? So they had us with these butt packs as part of our uniform. But
Yeah.
if you called them a fanny pack, well, you were saying something untoward, because fanny means something different in European
Right.
culture than it does
That's right.
our culture. And so learning those things so that you don't offend, but you also learn, oh, well, that's an odd name for that particular body part. It's an interesting thing. And I would go to this restaurant after a 10, 12-hour day. And this one gentleman was from Boston, but he was from Greece, had lived in Boston, came back to Greece. So he spoke a few languages, and he and I would sit and chat for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a night, and just get to know each other. And it was interesting because when I was there, they had the Algerians coming in to the country and doing all of the cheap labor for building the stadiums and so on for the Olympics.
Yeah.
And it was such an interesting thing for me because we have in this country what we call the Mexicans, right? It's not Mexican people, it's the Mexicans that will do your cheap labor. And I was thinking, every country's is going to have immigrants that they call taking their jobs and doing this kind of thing. And I think about it and I go, well, why weren't the Greeks doing the job? Because it was a lot easier, it would have been a lot easier to hire the people who were from there, right? So what is it about us as people in general that think that outsourcing and doing these kinds of things is such a wrong thing versus allowing people who want to work in something that they're good at and like doing, and then we get to do the things that we like doing, right? So how can we balance these two pieces so that they make more sense for people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to understand with those particular dimensions that there are certain people who look on certain kinds of jobs as being beneath them. There are other people who might not look on a particular job as being beneath them, but the job pays a lower amount per hour than the amount of money that they want to be making per hour. And so they won't take the job because they think it pays too little. And so when we've got and we've seen this throughout cultures around the world. I mean, the Japanese, for example, had this same kind of attitude toward Koreans for a long time, just as a for instance. You name the culture, there has been this kind of we're the real people of our country, and then we have these people that really aren't us, but we've got to bring them in because they'll do what we need doing, because they're willing to, and they're willing to get paid less than we're willing to get paid, and we've got more important things to do. So that kind of I mean, it's a form of elitism, obviously, and it it's also partly propelled, though, by in the United States by the old immigrant mentality. My parents, like you're talking about, when my grandparents came to the States, they came penniless. they gave up everything in their prior lives. And so my parents both grew up in tenements. They grew up in the slums, because their parents could barely make ends meet, because they were taking jobs that were the dregs of society kinds of jobs, in order to make enough money to not be deported, enough money to, because they all became American citizens, but they didn't have the education to, or the entrepreneurial spirit, if they didn't have the education to really succeed in high level ways. So they put all of their energy into making sure that their children got the kind of education in the United States that they didn't have, so their children could create better lives for themselves than their parents could. And my parents in turn had that same idea, that they wanted my brother and me to have a better life than they had. So we were intergenerationally, we were on an upward spiral in the belief in the American dream.
That's a good point. I think every generation is designed as a stepladder, right? And if we continually move up generation to generation to generation up that ladder, we can create something that's incredible. We just have to be willing to shift ladders when that ladder stops, right? So one ladder is 10 feet. We've got to be on a 20-foot ladder to get past, so we can switch. And right now we're on this trajectory of people who want to go backwards down the ladder again, right? And people who want to go forwards. We have this big confusion. I think it's a confusion, although a lot of people are very sure of themselves when it comes to progression versus regression. And, progressive and liberal has gotten a bad name. Conservative has gotten a bad name, and those kinds of things. So if we're ever going to change and create a new tomorrow, what are the elements that we have to look at in order to start moving forward on and keep going up the ladder versus regressing down?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think first of all, we have in our society a massive pandemic of learned helplessness.
Mm.
Uh, the belief nothing I do makes a difference. The negative things I do don't really impact other people. The positive things I do don't really impact other people. So all I'm left with is, let me live for today as much as I can, and I probably won't be alive in 10 years, so who cares? And so there's a nihilistic, self-serving kind of undercurrent in parts of our society. There's a learned helplessness undercurrent in parts of our society. There is um, a, a mentality in other parts of our society that says, well, we've achieved things that other people haven't achieved, so we're entitled to look down our noses at those people who haven't achieved what we think they should have achieved at that point in their lives, or in their generations of being American. So the first stage, I think, is about spotting the spell. It's about waking up to the ways in which our minds, there's a battle for our brains that's going on, and waking up to the ways that our minds are being hijacked, or that attempts to hijack our minds are occurring on a daily basis across the political and ideological spectrums. I think we need to align with our fundamental design. There are certain qualities that unite all of us as a species, as humanity. We all have the drive to be who we truly are. It's our drive for authenticity. We all have the drive to bond with others. It's our drive for connection. And we all have the drive to influence the world around us, and that's our drive for impact. When we forget that our basic nature is about living at the intersection of authenticity, connection, and impact, we are susceptible to being manipulated and propagandized by stuff out there that's trying to tell us that other things are more important than those things. So we have to align with our design or realign with our design. We have to strengthen our underpinnings. We have to strengthen our teachability, our personal well-being, our health, our self-care, our discernment, our ability to recognize those kinds of subtle thought processes, critical thinking, if you will, rather than this ridiculous, either or polarized thinking. We have to learn how to recognize the promptings from our deepest selves. We have to learn how to recognize wisdom that comes from whatever source we individually happen to feel connected with, that we are a part of, and that's larger than us. We need to learn how to harvest profound blessings and gifts from undesired and even unacceptable life experiences. We need all of those underpinnings in order to function in thrival rather than survival as individuals. We need to learn how to have right relationship with our power rather than to either run from power because the role models we see around power are modeling really screwed up dysfunctional versions of power, so we want nothing to do with power, or to pursue dysfunctional power. And we need to be really good at facilitating repair and evolution in whatever spheres of influence we're called to have positive impact. If we're all doing that, if we're all busy doing those kinds of things, then our differences become cherished and our common bond becomes sacred. And when we get that way of functioning as a society, the way we're going to function is vastly different from how we're functioning today.
Yeah, there was a number of things that you said there that I really enjoyed hearing. And one of the things that, my mentor, I call him Buckminster Fuller, would say is that we have to get over the auspicious, and this is a paraphrase, so don't quote me on it, but it's paraphrased.
Sure.
Get over the auspicious notion that we have to work to be of value. And I go back, when I hear that phrase in my head, I go back to people like Thomas Jefferson, Leonardo da Vinci, Plato, I go back to the people that we consider great people of history. And I think, were they valuable in their lifetime, or were they valuable in their death? Were they valuable as human beings because they created what they created, or because they existed to begin with? And when I think of this notion, I think of all the technology that we have created and all of the technology that we can create. And we've seemed to placed so much emphasis of value on how much a person works versus what a person contributes and the results that we get. We do this in medicine all the time. A doctor gets paid for procedures, not for results, not for what they create, but for what they treat. And so to me, I want to go backwards a little bit to a time in which we don't have the technology. Now, this is just a utopian theory at the moment, right? I believe that we have borrowed, with all the technology that we have and we consume, we've borrowed our imaginations from other people, and thereby have left our own imagination by the wayside. And that's going to become more and more evident in the next couple generations, right? So how do we stop borrowing other people's imaginations? And I call that, game boxes, any kind of game boxes and internets and TVs and so on. When we had more time on our hands, we did more with the time that we had. I don't believe that people are lazy. I believe that people have been conditioned to cut their imaginations and thereby not create and be authentic in who they could be. So how do we get back to being our authentic selves when we have to eat and we have to live and we have to pay to be valuable?
So let me answer at a macro level and a micro level. At the macro level, we are culturally still in a phase with technology where we are intoxicated with it. So it's a new toy, a new set of toys, and we're drunk. We're drunk on the new toy. And so, of course, the toy becomes the boss of us, and we relinquish our thought process to this new toy. Developmentally, in a society, those phases are eventually outgrown, where we ultimately develop right relationship with new innovations rather than be intoxicated by them. At the micro level, I think it's crucial for each one of us to discover and move into alignment with whatever our deepest sense of life purpose happens to be. Because when we're living in alignment with our purpose, our creativity comes back online, and things like technology become what they're meant to be in the first place, which is tools to propel our creativity and our imagination rather than substitutes for being creative and imaginative. And I love that you brought up Bucky Fuller. One of my favorite of many quotes of his is, "The best way to predict the future is to invent it." And we've got the tail wagging the dog here. We're looking at trying to figure out how to predict the future so that we can be ready for it, rather than asking ourselves, what is the future we want to create together, the future we want to live in? What is the world we want to live in and the world we want to leave to our children and our grandchildren? We need to stop predicting it and start inventing it. And of course, like you said, in order to do that, we have to re-own our creativity.
Absolutely. You know, I'd like you to maybe expand on that a little bit, these ideas, because this is really what my book and this podcast is about, is how do we go about with tools, with techniques, with training, with mindset, how do we go about taking this world that we created, right? And saying, okay, the way I look at it is, this is not optimal. We can create it better. So how do we create something that is more optimal for our own human growth? So let's expand on this for a little bit, and just, I'm going to let you kind of go, because I know you've done a lot of thinking about it. We've talked about this before.
Yeah. Well, on a brass tacks level, we can simply start making a habit of doing what is already being done in a more narrow way in high functioning companies. In a high functioning company, among other things, one of the traditions or rituals in a high functioning company is that teams get together regularly, not just once in a while. They get together regularly and they ask the question, what's working well and why does that matter? What positive impact do those things that are working well have? And then they ask a second question, what could be even better? What would be even better ifs? What if we did this and that and this other thing differently? Why would that matter? What positive impacts would the up-leveling of best practices have? And a healthy company is constantly looking at their best practices and saying, well, those might have been the best practices 10 years ago, and thank goodness we developed them. Today, in the middle of the COVID crisis, not so much. What best practices would we invent now? That same kind of boots on the ground attitude is equally relevant to crafting an elevated society. We need to look at what's working well and why that matters so that we will do those things more. And we need to look at the even better ifs and how different changes and improvements are going to elevate our functioning as a society. So, if we're looking at, let's just say, capitalism, for example, most people don't know that there are two versions of capitalism and one version of something else that gets called capitalism but isn't. And most people just, lump all of those things together. And so there are a lot of people in society that are viciously, fiercely anti-capitalism. Well, when I ask those people to tell me their version of capitalism, what they inevitably describe is what I and others who study this call sociopathic capitalism, the sociopathic version of capitalism, where I manipulate you into buying what you don't need at a price you can't afford, and I'll manipulate you so well that I'll convince you that doing that makes you happy. That's sociopathic capitalism. Or I'll make profits at the expense of killing off the environment. That's sociopathic capitalism. When I ask people who are anti-capitalist how they define capitalism, they invariably define sociopathic capitalism. They have no idea that there's such a thing as healthy capitalism or collaborative capitalism, the way that you and I know about, where we're creating win-wins. And then there's a third group that defines capitalism in a way that has nothing to do with capitalism. They're defining a completely different economic system that I call debtism, which is borrowing against an uncertain future in order to prop up the illusion of a lifestyle in the present. There's nothing about capitalism that has anything to do with that. It's a completely different economic system. It has nothing to do with capitalism. So if we don't sit down and really look at what our structures really are, what is our economy based on? Well, we have an economy, just to finish up this little strand, we have an economy that's based on an assumption that perpetual growth is good. And most people just buy it. They buy it as an economic assumption. That's an example of a belief system that has an assumption that's neither verifiable nor unverifiable. It's neither true nor false that perpetual growth is good. What we have to have the courage to look at is, what are the costs of perpetual growth? What are the prices of perpetual growth? And is there a way to continue to grow sanely, because evolution is part of our makeup, but to not make growth the boss of us? What about the notion of enoughness? What about the notion of sustainability? And looking at growth in those frames of reference. So until we find the courage to say we have to reevaluate what patriotism is, what the American dream is, if we're in the United States, or what the dream of our country is if we're elsewhere, what economics looks like, what happiness looks like, what growth looks like, what alignment with being stewards of a planet looks like. Until we have the courage to sit down and ask these kinds of questions without getting into polarized, divisive arm wrestling matches over ideological addiction, we will continue to devolve into the opposite of utopian future. It's a dystopian future that we are actually co-creating right now. And yet at the same time, everyone says, well, we don't want a dystopian future, but no, we're not going to look at our basic assumptions. That's nuts thinking. That's insane. That is cultural opposite of mental health as a culture.
I like that you put it that way, because a lot of people I've talked to have issues sometimes just saying it like it is, and the truth is that if you're not saying something as it is, matter of factly, then you're doing a disservice to the situation at hand, and so to say something like that's insane thinking is going to cause people to say, I'm thinking that way and I'm not insane, right?
Therefore, you must be insane for saying that.
Exactly. Therefore, be insane. So, as an operational planner, along with all your other accolades, right? If we were going to operationally plan this, which is basically taking it from the result that we want and working our way down to the beginning, what would be the first steps on that operational plan to shift the system as it is and start that development into a lack of insanity?
Right. Well, you know, Stephen Covey, as you're very well aware of, who wrote Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, among other things, one of his principles that people regularly cite is the principle called begin with the end in mind. I think he almost got it right, but not quite. Begin with the best possible end in mind.
Mm.
If we don't start with a utopian vision, if we don't start with a vision of what we want to strive toward, the ideal future that we're not going to have tomorrow, but we have a true north that we're pointing toward. If we don't have that, then we don't have a country. This country, the United States, was birthed based in large part on, and in its origins, a utopian vision. And then they got to crafting the Constitution and made all kinds of compromises and disenfranchised certain people and allowed slavery to continue and all kinds of nasty, dark, shadowy stuff. But it started off as a vision of a society that is functioning at the intersection of personal freedom and the common good, where all are considered to be equal in terms of their right to have opportunity to make of it as they will, and where the government was mandated to function and legislate at the intersection of what preserves individual freedom and what promotes the common good. That was an audacious idea that people would actually be in a society whose government was mandated to be a servant to its citizens, not to itself, not to the common good. I'm sorry, not to special interests, not to itself. That was a radical notion back then. It was a utopian notion back then. What I would say to you today is all of those utopian notions, great concept, still never been tried.
Yeah, I've said that quite a lot, when I hear people talk about the Constitution and how amazing it is. And I'll say it would be great if we actually tried to live by the ideals that we claim, right? Because we hear a lot of claims of what this country is at its finest possibility. But I've never seen the attempt for it to be lived that way and understood that way. And so there's always been such a dichotomy, a divergence between ideal and reality. And I want to help bring the ideal into reality. So what do we need to do in order to create that?
The master planning, again, starts with envisioning the best possible end, getting on the same page about what that looks like in principle. And then reverse engineering, coming backwards from that best possible end to the question of where are we now in relationship to that? And how do we deliberately construct a bridge that takes us from where we are now to that best possible end over time with patience and persistence and a dedication to not abandoning the vision. This is what great companies do. It's what great societies are theoretically capable of doing, but not if we're fighting against each other over whose ideology is right and wrong.
That's a good point, because my question to you based on that is, everybody has their own vision of what utopia is, right? They have their own belief system about it, and most of the belief system is created by the traumas that they've experienced in their life and the experiences. I say trauma first because the traumas and the experience are really what shape our belief system, and
Spot on.
what we think of as utopia in our heads may not necessarily be the answer for our hearts and our, and our humanity. So how do we bridge that gap first?
Right. Well, what you're speaking to right now, and I'm loving that you're bringing this up, Ari, is again, it's kind of like a variation on that UNICEF New Year's card that my family got. The greater peace will only come with this after the smaller peace we make with each other. And what I would add is, and within ourselves. We human beings tend to be have an inner community of self that is at war with itself. And the war comes from our traumas. The war comes from the undigested life experiences that we've had, the life experiences we've been through that we didn't know, and we still haven't figured out how to harvest great, deep spiritual gifts from. So those pieces of unfinished business remain the boss of us. And if we go back to Maslow, when someone is in survival mode, they don't see utopia. They don't see what's possible, because all they're settling for is surviving. It's like the Ballad of Jack and Diane, John Cougar Mellencamp, and the line from that song is, "Life goes on long after the thrill of living is gone." Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? But that's the majority of society. They are believing that they just have to muddle through in life. They long ago gave up their ideals, their vision, and it's because of what you said, Ari. They have been taught to tolerate undigested life experiences inside themselves, and to believe that the best they can do is hope to live with their scars, rather than being shown ways that they can transform through their scars into an elevated way of living.
Wow, that was a very beautiful way of putting it. And to any listener out there who's thinking, I don't know what to do next. I'm listening to you and I'm understanding the words that you're saying, and I just don't know what to do next. Where would you, suggest somebody start with that?
Well, I'll say something that might sound self-serving, but it really is my answer to the question. I have an online course called The Integrity Guide to Having It All: How to Put Your Genius Where Your Dreams Are. And that course teaches people not simply a mindset, but very specific step by step sequenced skills that are developed in a specific order, because one set of skills builds on the next. And the entire focus of that course is to help people outgrow their survival plan and upgrade their thrival plan and their ability to live their thrival plan. That's the resource that I would recommend.
Awesome. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because while I don't mind you being a little self-serving, I was being self-serving in having you mention a word, which is integrity. And I think a lot of people mistaken what integrity is to something outside of themselves, not something within themselves.
Yes.
An action that you take versus a way that you feel inside of you. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit more about integrity itself, and how that relates to a person taking on actions outside of themselves before they do the work inside.
Right. Which of course never works well. If we take actions outside of ourselves before we've done the inner work, then if we're taking action from a foundation of crap, we're going to get crap. Very simple. Now, about integrity. Integrity is one of those words that unfortunately falls in a category I refer to as true but not useful, because tons of people truly and authentically, not as lip service, but tons of people truly believe in the idea of integrity. But when I ask them to tell me what integrity is and what skills are necessary, they don't know how to answer. And so forget it for the moment about ill-intended people who don't believe in integrity. What I'm talking about right now are people who authentically believe in integrity. Just like most people authentically believe in collaboration, but they've never been trained in the skills that enable them to walk the talk. So what is integrity? Integrity revolves around the three core drives that I was referring to earlier. Our drive to be who we truly are, authenticity, our drive to bond with others, connection, and our drive to influence the world around us, impact. Authenticity, our authenticity core drive, is about being in integrity with ourselves, with the promptings that come from our deepest self, our deepest nature, our deepest callings. And connection, the connection core drive is about relationship integrity, doing what we say we're going to do, and holding ourselves accountable when what we do is not aligned with our intentions. And then impact, our impact core drive, corresponds with collective or societal integrity, being in integrity with the groups that we are a part of. So integrity is not one-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. And as someone who was primarily motivated for the largest part of my life up until about 20 years ago by contributing to societal integrity, I sacrificed my self-integrity. I killed off my first marriage. Well, that was co-created. The killing off was co-created. But my part in killing off my first marriage was because I became so self-neglectful that my heart shut down. And even though I was a dutiful husband and I did all the right things, and I didn't do them as a martyr or feeling like I was sacrificing myself, I became so depleted that the thing that my first wife most rightly wanted from me, which was my heart, stopped being available. So I was out of integrity with myself and in my primary relationship, all while I was pursuing all of my social improvement initiatives. And that is what I call one-dimensional integrity. It was a light bulb moment when I realized that I understood a fair amount of relationship integrity, even though I was falling to the wayside with some of that. And I understood a lot about societal integrity, but I didn't count integrity with myself as a form of integrity. There are other people who are at a different point with that, where they're all about themselves and they're all about being in integrity with themselves. And if you don't like who I am and what I do, that's your problem. Well, that's one-dimensional integrity. That's not three-dimensional integrity. Integrity is three-dimensional.
That's, that's a really good point, because I've had similar experiences, and I think that everybody can relate to this, is sacrificing yourself for others, or sacrificing yourself or sacrificing others for yourself, right? I think that we can relate to this as a regular thing. And I don't think that it's necessarily common to have only one of these things, right? Depending on the relationship, I'm sacrificing myself here for the better good here, or I'm sacrificing the better good for this here, or I'm, sacrificing in the middle, right? We're always having a balancing act between sacrificing our integrity and keeping it, because We are such a busy society because we've had to create our value by what we do. And this kind of goes back to the original part of our conversation is the sacrifice for work and money worth the lack of integrity towards ourselves? And if not, how can we as a society lift each other up to that place of integrity versus, you know, I let's just say I didn't vote. Somebody doesn't vote, right? Why? Because I don't feel like my vote counts, as you were saying at the beginning of this conversation. Well, that's
Learned helplessness.
sacrificing my integrity as a contributing impact person, both to myself and to the society at large, right? So how
Yep.
do we shift this perspective from nothing I do really matters anyway?
This is what you're pointing toward is people's belief in a law of scarcity. That in order to have this, I have to sacrifice that. And when we allow that either or thinking to affect our happiness formula, we're basically screwed. So if I think that I have to sacrifice my integrity in order to have financial well-being, or that I have to sacrifice financial well-being in order to keep my integrity, I am engaging in psychospiritual insanity. I'm engaging in either or thinking when what our design is both and thinking. Our design is to live at the intersection of our authenticity, our connection with others, and our positive impact in the world. It's not one being sacrificed for the other two, or two being sacrificed for one of them. It's all three in synergy, in collaboration with each other. We have collectively forgotten that vision of being human.
Mm.
And because of that, we are operating as a society. Again, there are some lovely individuals who have, awakened from the spell. But as a society, we are still under the spell of a profoundly and dysfunctionally and harmfully sick happiness formula. It is not a real happiness formula. It's a dystopian formula. And we don't know it collectively. And it's time that people started calling it like it is. I am not a fan of political correctness. I am a fan, huge fan, of treating people with respect, compassion, and regard. And when I am civil with people, when I am authentically respectful to them, toward them, and compassionate toward them, I don't have to worry one split second about political correctness. Political correctness is an attempt to legislate morality, and morality cannot be legislated. It can only be developed in us because we've healed those traumas that you were referring to earlier, so that we are living our authentic self rather than our wounded self.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that I'm not a fan of political correctness. I'm not a fan so much of correctness at all.
Yeah.
Really, like if somebody were to point out the experience of my life, there's very rare moments that I've actually been what somebody else might consider to be correct. And I would imagine that that's probably the same thing behind closed doors that anybody and everybody else that's listening would be able to relate to, is that correctness is it's unlegislatable because nobody has the same morality. Not a single person has every single thing in alignment with another person's morality. And so how can we possibly legislate that? We've tried because of religion. So religion originally was the first attempt at legislating morality, in my opinion, right? Let's see what we can do to take a community that's tribal, right? And create a civil society so that we can all live together in somewhat peace and harmony, right? And then let's create some rules around that. So like, don't covet, don't steal, don't murder, right? These are all commandments, but really what they are is legislating a level of morality, because, you know, don't murder unless of course you're being attacked, right? Don't don't covet somebody's goods unless it's driving you to be better so that you can afford those goods also. I mean, we really have a slippery slope when it comes to legislating morality, legislating vices, and telling people what they can and can't do with their personal space. However, when you talk about companies, as you were saying earlier, and legislating what companies can do to people's space, that might be a little bit different. And we've kind of gone backwards on this, and we stopped legislating corporate structures in favor of deregulation, right? And started to regulate people's behavior as it relates to things, even, like in the olden days in the 20s of alcohol prohibition. So we prohibit the things that we think as a society are morally questionable, and then we allow a company to poison our food, poison our water, poison our air in attempts for profit, for money. So, when we look at this as a society at large and we go, is this working optimally? Is this moving our world and our society forward? I say no, caveat, maybe a little in some places and not in others. But really, the whole point of this conversation is to awaken people into some other points of view that may not be politically correct or agree with your point of view. So how do we agree to disagree and still be authentically ourselves without having to worry about the offense of political correctness?
The way I think we start to do that is by establishing first what we agree to agree upon. So what I mean by that, for example, is that I have a different perspective about the Ten Commandments. I view the Ten Commandments not as commandments, but as promises. That when you are in alignment with love, you can't help but behave those ways. Not because you should, but because behaving in any way other than those ways would just be out of integrity for you. It wouldn't feel good. It wouldn't feel right. I don't agree that there is no universal morality. I am firmly convinced that there is, but it's not a theology. It's a universal morality that is built into our fundamental human nature related to our three core drives. That when we are truly who we are designed to be, when we are authentic, when we are bonded, when we're connected, when we are loving, and when we are devoted to having positive impact in the world, that expression of our three core drives is our fundamental morality and is integrity. In other words, what I'm saying is we are designed by our wiring to live in integrity. And it is our trauma structure. It's our unfinished business. It's our societal programming that is dysfunctional societal programming that seduces us out of our fundamental human nature. We don't have to learn how to love. We have to remove the blocks to the awareness of love's presence. presence. We don't have to learn how to be authentic. We don't have to change ourselves. We have to remove the traumas that stand between us and being authentic. So I think there is a fundamental universal morality, and it's built into our wiring. And when we can agree on what we have yes about, then we can put our differences into a context that allow our differences to enrich us rather than divide us.
That's beautifully stated, and I like having people who disagree with me because that allows me to learn something new. And it's why when I'm looking on Facebook, for instance, I'll start searching for things that go completely against my point of view, so
Mm-hmm.
that I don't fall into that echo chamber thought bubble that we started talking about. And I have the ability to then say, okay, what is this? And, I've never had the thought, I think I got to disfriend this person because of what they're posting, right? I've never had that as something that I've thought, they don't agree with me. I think I'm going to defriend them, right?
Yeah.
Such a foreign kind of a concept in my world. So how come it's such a common fundamental thing happening in the world? Because it just seems ridiculous to me.
Well, at the macro level, I think it's happening in the world today because we have a species, that species being humanity, that is in a collective state of terror. And the collective state of terror that I believe humanity is in right now is that all of the old structures are crumbling because they're being outgrown. The structures that were helpful in propelling us forward in fits and starts and imperfectly for the last couple of thousand years are not the structures that are going to propel us forward the next couple of thousand years. And when people fall into a trap that I think we're programmed to fall into, which is to identify who we are through what we believe, then if what we believe starts to crumble, we stop thinking we can know who we are. So we desperately cling to old belief systems in order to hold on to some version of identity.
Mm.
And that's a very false version of identity. You were talking about being a human doing, right? And when society teaches us to be human doings, when first and foremost we are human beings, right? And this is I think at the heart of the problem. Our ways of understanding and our ways of functioning are crumbling. It's scaring the crap out of most people, and so they are becoming more and more tightly bonded, tightly woven to their belief system because they are afraid they won't know who they are if those systems crumble.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. As I was thinking about what you're saying, the image in my head was that of meat inside of a pressure cooker, right? You put the meat in the pressure cooker and it's hard. You put it in, it massive amounts of pressure and heat make it soft.
Yep.
Versus, say, a diamond that's been created over years of intense pressure and heat, right? Creates this beautiful thing called a diamond. And I believe that in some ways, the weaknesses of our society were caused because our culture was, like you were saying earlier, our parents wanted us to have it better than they had it. And so they attempted at every point to remove the pressure cooker. And the way I look at it, it begins with C-sections at birth, because they have found that the people who have C-sections that are born from a C-section, and this isn't to say to somebody who's had one, you're bad for having one. It's just to say that in general, that the first struggle of a human being is the struggle for life, coming out that small tube and then coming out into the world. And we have removed that first struggle. And some people have postulated that that has itself become part of the weaknesses of the people who have been born that way. I know that when Gabriel was born, we had to have a C-section because of a fibroid. And we did what we called a natural C-section, which was smaller hole. And we had him like squeeze out more, so it would be mimicking more experience, right?
Yep.
But the more we coddle our society, the more we remove the pressure cooker. And you know, the lesson of the lobster is the same. A lobster outgrows his shell by making the shell so tight around the body that it has to be removed. And we have artificially removed the shell and thus stunted the growth, right? What do you think of any of what I just said?
I think it's spot on. I think that part of why we have so many immune system problems in people today is because we stopped, you know, when I was a kid, we didn't have the term free range children because all of us were free range children, so there wasn't a term for it. It's what kids did. They ran around and had a great time together and got in trouble sometimes and fell and scraped their knee or broke their leg or whatever it was. And parents who coddled their children, on the other hand, these were the children who grew up with entitlement disorder. These are the children who grew up thinking that the world owed them something because they didn't grow up with self-responsibility. They didn't grow up with experiencing growth coming from pain. Not to say that we should be seeking out pain all the time, because I don't think we're supposed to seek out pain all the time. I think we're supposed to be familiar enough with pain so we don't run from it, and so it can wizen us. It can help us become wiser rather than more defeated. So, you know, when we have a society that is antiseptic, that is trying to protect people, we fall into that old teaching story. You've probably heard it too, about the little boy who's out in the woods, and one day he sees this butterfly trying to make its way out of the cocoon, and he is standing there feeling what feels to him like deep compassion. All he wants to do is to save this butterfly from the pain of having to break out of its cocoon so it can fly away. And so he breaks the cocoon open, and the butterfly falls dead to the ground. He picks up the butterfly and he runs home to his mother, and he's crying, and he's saying, what happened? I tried to help this butterfly and it died. What a horrible person am I? What did I do wrong? And of course, the mom's response in this teaching story, the healthy response, was, honey, your compassion was wonderful. And you tried to save this butterfly from an experience it needed to have in order to be able to fly away, and you simply didn't know that. And this in turn reminds me of one of my favorite sayings from a 20th century theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr, which is that our mission is, if we really care about elevating people and about elevating the world. Our mission is to both comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable.
Mm.
Not one or the other, both. And this is what I was referring to in the beginning, in our first segment about, at the end of the segment about the two forms of love. If we have nurturance without challenge, nurturing love without challenging love, we get narcissistic, entitled people. If we have challenging without nurturance, challenging love without nurturance, we get shamed and disempowered people or tyrants. It's got to be both and. But we don't live in a both and society anymore. We live in an either or society, and that is the fundamental sickness of our society today, is vastly immature either or thinking that we are programmed into having, and that we better wake the hell up out of if we want to evolve into a next golden age.
That's a very profound thing. And you know, I'm going to ask you a question I haven't asked anybody, which is, if I was to ask you a question that would sum up the sum total of everything we've talked about, right? And give us that path forward so that we can create a new tomorrow, so that we can activate our vision for a better world, and so that we can be these impactful, integrous humans that we were designed to be. What would that path be?
It would be the path toward what you've heard me say. It's the path toward self-sovereignty that serves us all. It's the intersection of self-responsibility in the context of living in a society where we are responsible for ourselves and we are contributing to the common good, not one over the other. Self-sovereignty that serves us all.
That's beautiful. And I so appreciate you being here. And I think we've had plenty of tools that somebody can take away from this conversation and start applying. If you were to give just one other tool for the how, so that somebody can take that conceptual knowledge and wisdom that we just spent an hour and a half disseminating, right? One simple tool to activate that in them, what would that tool be?
The tool would be a piece of imagery that's about shifting our mindset. And the imagery is of a jigsaw puzzle. So imagine a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces are out on the table and they're all upside down. And we're in a group of people and we're all busy turning all the pieces over so that we see what's on each piece. And then, sure enough, some of us cluster around finding pieces that are the corners of the puzzle. And others of us cluster around finding pieces that are the edges of the puzzle. And others of us start making discoveries about parts of inside the puzzle that are elements of the picture that the puzzle is creating, like a window or a door or a flower or whatever. And imagine that one other thing, which is that unlike a typical jigsaw puzzle where on the cover of the box you see what the puzzle is supposed to look like when it's done, there's no box. So we don't know what the puzzle's supposed to look like when it's done. And we have two choices. We can either start to polarize and accuse the cornerists of being horrific people because all they care about is the corners, or the edgists, or the flowerists, or the doorists, or the windowists, rather than saying, isn't it wonderful that you're so focused on the corners that you're identifying those on behalf of all of us, and the edges and the flowers and the doors and the windows, so that we can co-discover together what the picture is meant to look like when it's all put together. That vision of synergy, of collaboration, if we can keep that in mind and in our hearts and in our spirits when we are interacting with other people who have different perspectives from ours, the magic is just going to start happening. That's the last tool I'll leave you with.
Oh, that's a beautiful image. And I so appreciate you being here. I appreciate this conversation and the gifts that you've just given the audience. I hope that they will walk away from this conversation having pulled at least 20 or 30, not just one, but 20 or 30 good gems that they can then take with them and really, really start to create their new tomorrow and activate their vision for a better world, because this is my way of impacting the world, is to bring these kinds of conversations out into full view of the public so that we can have deep, considerate conversations about where we want to be, who we want to be, and what we want to create in this world. And I really appreciate you being here. What's again, I'd like you to actually say the website both for you as well as for that particular integrity piece, and how people can get a hold of you if they'd like to learn more from you.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for your mission of service, because what you're doing through this podcast has the potential to have widespread, important, significant impact, positive impact in the world. So my main website is drgruder.com. That's drgruder.com. And if you want to be in touch with me, you'll find on drgruder.com a blue button that says contact, and click on the blue button and you'll have different ways of contacting me. The Integrity Guide to Having It All course, that's available. You can find that by going to drgruder.com/academy. That'll take you to the Dr. Gruder Academy page, and it's the first course that's listed, drgruder.com/academy.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you, audience, for sticking with us, listening to this episode. And I wish you a really, really blessed day. And I wish you the cojones to challenge yourself to become the person that you know you are already inside, and to shift what you might be doing now to create something more based on results, performance, and create a better world with us, collaborate with us, so that we together can bring in and usher in this new society that is focused on creating a world we all can live in harmony with nature. And I bless you all. Hope you have a healthy day. This has been another episode of Create a New Tomorrow with your host, Ari Gronich. And thank you so much, David Gruder, for being here. We really appreciate all of your wisdom and experience.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. I appreciate all you do to create a new tomorrow for yourself and those around you. If you'd like to take this information further and are interested in joining a community of like-minded people who are all passionate about activating their vision for a better world, go to the website createanewtomorrow.com and find out how you can be part of making a bigger difference. I have a gift for you just for checking it out, and look forward to seeing you take the leap and joining our private paid mastermind community. Until then, see you on the next episode.